Hello again. Welcome to this series of podcasts concerning periodic financial support of children. This module, including these podcasts, is designed to reflect as closely as practicable the structure of Chapter 16 of your prescribed textbook, Family Law Principles. I strongly recommend that chapter to you. This first podcast will examine some core concepts, including a child support assessment and the child support formula. We'll also take a brief look at some social context. The second podcast deals with a specific type of application called a change of assessment in special circumstances. The third podcast will examine child support agreements. It's not going to be possible within these podcasts to examine in much detail the residual jurisdiction of a court under the Family Law Act for maintenance of a child. We will examine it briefly at the end of the third podcast, but it is discussed in more detail at pages 555 through to 565 of your prescribed text. These podcasts, by way of overview, will cover three basic matters. In the first podcast, I'll deal with the concept of a child support assessment and the child support formula. In the second podcast, I'll take you through the requirements for a change of assessment in special circumstances, and in the third podcast, I'll also deal with the issue of child support agreements. In this very first podcast, though, our focus will be on introduction to the study of the area of child support, explaining how a child support assessment works, and examining the very complicated child support formula. Just a bit of social context. The Department of Human Services, which is responsible for administration of the Child Support Agency, publishes some information about the service performance of the Child Support Agency and statistical information about the number of customers. As you can see, some 1.2 million children in Australia are the subject of child support assessment. In that context, it is very important for you, as potential future family lawyers, to have an understanding of how the child support system works, the potential issues that may come up in practice, and how to advise about them. Note that the number of children under the child support scheme has remained fairly stable for the past couple of years. The Child Support Assessment Act is your main focus for this module. This Act sets out the children that are covered by the child support scheme, a very detailed mechanism for calculating the amount of child support payable, child support agreements, and the limited circumstances in which an application can be made to a court. There are some detailed, and for the purposes of this course, not particularly relevant, historical matters about why the Family Law Act has a residual jurisdiction to deal with cases in which the Child Support Assessment Act does not apply. For the purposes of this course, you only need to know that the child maintenance provisions in Part 7 of the Family Law Act will only apply if financial support is sought from a step-parent, or for a child who is over 18 years, or the payer parent is not in a jurisdiction with treaty arrangements with Australia, or the very rarely used application for the payment of medical expenses relating to a child's birth. Otherwise, the Child Support Assessment Act will apply. The other Act that we will briefly touch on in this module is the Child Support Registration and Collection Act 1988, Commonwealth. This Act, as the title suggests, empowers the Child Support Agency to collect and enforce child support arrears. The Act gives the Child Support Agency power to issue notices to employers to pay child support from an employee's wages, to take a payer's tax refund, and other powers in relation to enforcement. The Act also provides a framework for the Child Support Agency to make an application to a court on a payee's behalf for enforcement of a child support liability. That Act also contains some procedural provisions dealing with objections to decisions. Objections are dealt with in brief in your prescribed text, but won't be covered in these podcasts. Let's start with a key concept of child support assessment. Section 77 of the Child Support Assessment Act says that if a child support assessment is validly issued, then child support is payable for the child or children by the payer parent to the carer or payee parent. In other words, This legislation imposes a liability upon the payer parent without a need for a court order or any cause of action or any court proceedings. Section 79 of the Child Support Assessment Act says that the amount of child support due and payable by a payer parent to a carer entitled to payment is a debt due and payable by the parent paying to the parent receiving. However, Section 30 of the Child Support Registration and Collection Act says that if the liability becomes collectible by the Child Support Agency, then it is a debt to the Commonwealth of Australia, not to the payee or carer parent. I just wanted to show you briefly what an application for a child support assessment looks like. It is a very simple process. On your slide is a screenshot from the Commonwealth Department of Human Services website. Applications for a child support assessment can be made over the phone or online, or using a relatively straightforward form. The URL is there on your slide. Once the application is made by someone to the Child Support Agency, the agency is required to process the application and will send to both of the parents the child support assessment just in the form of a letter. The letter also sets out in detail the information used to calculate the assessment and, as we will examine shortly, the very complicated steps used to calculate the amount payable. Sections 35 through to Section 64 A of the Child Support Assessment Act, and on my rough count, forgiving my maths, is about 85 different sections, sets out the ways in which child support assessments can be calculated. It is well outside the scope of this course to go through each section, and not particularly necessary, as there are online calculators available to work out the amounts. Section 35, though, of the Child Support Assessment Act sets out an outline of the 8 basic steps in a single case. The calculation requires working out each parent's income, adding them together, working out what percentage of the overall income each parent earns, comparing that to the amount of time that the children spends with each parent, examining that time in light of deemed cost of children, and then producing a result. For the purposes of this course, it will be sufficient for you to understand some of the key concepts within the formula. We'll be going to those concepts shortly. I'll say it now, and I'll remind you again shortly, that you will not be required, let me say that, not be required, at any time in this course to undertake any sort of mathematical calculation of a child support assessment. Let's turn though to some of those key concepts within the 8 steps. Section 41 of the Child Support Assessment Act provides a mechanism for working out each parent's income for the purposes of the child support formula. It involves taking each parent's adjusted taxable income less a deemed self-support amount and, if a parent has multiple child support cases, deducting an appropriate multi-case allowance. Section 55B of the Child Support Assessment Act provides that working out the cost percentage of each parent is calculated by dividing that parent's income against the total parent's income. How much a parent should be contributing in terms of percentage of costs is not calculated in a directly lineal way. Section 55 of the Child Support Assessment Act provides a sub-formula converting the actual number of nights per year into a deemed percentage of contribution towards the costs of a child. Schedule 1 of the Child Support Assessment Act sets out the costs of children, which is itself worked out as a percentage of male total average weekly earnings. I think from that brief overview I have sufficiently demonstrated the complexity of the formula. An example of a single case assessment extracted directly from the Child Support Agency's Child Support Guide appears at pages 537 to 538 of your prescribed textbook. Further and much more detailed reading can be found at the Child Support Agency's online guide, the web address of which is on your slide. Let me briefly summarise the assessment process for you. An application is made to the Child Support Agency for an assessment. The assessment is calculated using a particularly complicated statutory formula that takes into account the parents' incomes, the amount of time the children spend with each parent, and the relative costs of children. Once the assessment issues, a payer parent is legally bound to pay the money, either to the other parent or, if the Commonwealth elects to collect the money, then as a debt due to the Commonwealth. The liability arises without any need for court intervention. I should add that when circumstances change, for example a change in the taxable income of each party, the Child Support Agency can, and often does, issue a fresh assessment for a child support period. This means that the amount of child support will vary from time to time. Parents can also provide estimates about their future income, which, subject to some serious penalties if those estimates are wrong, can be used to calculate the amount payable. There are a few practical matters I'd like to address. In the next podcast, we'll be examining some case law. Many of those cases were decided prior to 1989, that is, prior to the enactment of the Child Support Assessment Act, and therefore decided under the Family Law Act. The principles from those cases are applied to child support. It is very easy, though, with cases under the Family Law Act applying principles under the Child Support Assessment Act, to fall into the trap of confusing the legislation. Unless a fact scenario specifically says as much, you should assume that you are advising clients under the provisions of the Child Support Assessment Act, and you will find in practice you are almost always providing advice under the Child Support Assessment Act. In past exams, students were required to demonstrate knowledge of the existence of the formula and the key concepts contained in the formula. There was no requirement to set out the 8 steps in section 35, and again, in case there is any doubt, you will not be required as part of this course to calculate or apply the child support formula. Thanks for listening to this introductory podcast. Next is a change of child support assessment in special circumstances and the limited circumstances in which a court may have jurisdiction to hear applications under the Child Support Assessment Act. Bye for now.